Today's verse is famous, perhaps one of the more famous verses in the Bible. And it's famous because it's said to be the shortest verse in the Bible. So this verse is John 11:35, and the verse is simply this: Jesus wept. Now, it's usually thought of as the shortest verse in the Bible. It's often quoted as that in facts and figures and all this kind of thing, and trivia questions. But it's only the case that it's the shortest verse in most English translations. I'd go that far.
There is a discussion if it is actually the shortest one in the Greek New Testament. There we have another candidate in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, the first one, 5:16. Pantote chairete, so be always happy or cheerful. So this is again in Greek only 2 words and less letters.
But even in some English translations, actually, there is a shorter verse, and that's Job 3:2, and it simply says, "He said," or Job said. So I think some people, or it's often assumed that Jesus wept must be somehow related to the cross and the death of Jesus. And the verse comes about halfway through the Gospel of John, and chapter 11 begins with a message being sent to Jesus saying, "Your friend Lazarus is extremely ill." Now, Jesus' response at this point is not to go and visit Lazarus, despite the fact that we know they're friends. And Jesus appears supremely confident that Lazarus, that he says this sickness won't be to death. Eventually he does decide that they'll go and visit Lazarus. And again, he shows a sort of strange, divine almost confidence that Lazarus will be okay. He says to his disciples even that Lazarus will die, but he will raise Lazarus. On the way, one of Lazarus's 2 sisters, another person who Jesus is familiar with, Martha, she comes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, you're too late. Lazarus has died. If only you'd been here sooner." And Jesus says to her, again with this confidence that he's had in the power of God, he says, "It's okay, Lazarus will be raised." But then Jesus gets closer, and the second sister of Lazarus, Mary, so we've got Martha and Mary. Mary comes to Jesus, and Mary says, "Jesus, you're too late." And Mary falls at Jesus' feet and weeps. And it appears that he goes to the tomb, and it's at that point where he goes to the tomb of his friend Lazarus, Mary has wept at his feet. It's at that point at the tomb that John 11:35 says, Jesus wept. In John's Gospel, where this verse occurs, we've started off with Jesus as the divine Word, Jesus as God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And yet, by chapter 11, when we come here, we've heard the story as well of Jesus the man. And so the idea that Jesus, the Word, God, cries, and it's in the context of the death of one of his friends, I think this is what is quite profound, the idea that Jesus shows his humanity. And subsequently, the story is another famous one. It's the raising of Lazarus. So Jesus does raise Lazarus from the dead, and he's known this all along in the story, and yet in the middle here, he shows his compassion, his humanity in sharing the grief of those around him.
So I think what we have to keep in mind is that we deal here how John presents Jesus. So it's very hard to make here a historical judgment. But the way how John presents Jesus, that he knows all things, that he knows things beforehand, and that he's in complete control of the situation. And so in a way you can say when Jesus already knew when he was on his way to Bethany that he wanted to raise Lazarus to demonstrate his power over death, then why this kind of public show of emotions or feelings?
There is another interpretation. Some interpreters have said that Jesus is actually weeping because no one else has shared his faith in the power of God or in his own ability and identity to raise Lazarus. So Jesus is weeping because people don't believe that he will raise Lazarus. In the context, the fact that he goes to Lazarus' tomb and it's there that he weeps, I think shows perhaps more the idea of his sharing in the general mourning that's going on, rather than the idea of weeping at the lack of faith of those around him.
From a historical perspective, the most complicated question is, why do the other 3 synoptics, the other 3 evangelists, not mention this story at all? So if it's one of the key stories, and you can imagine raising somebody from the dead is something dramatic, but we don't have the story in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And this is why most scholars would assume that this is not a historical narrative at all, but it's kind of a help for the reader to understand the resurrection of Jesus and the meaning of the resurrection of Jesus.
But in terms of the idea of Jesus crying or weeping, that does come up elsewhere in the New Testament. Jesus weeps in Luke's Gospel when he's going towards Jerusalem. He knows Jerusalem will be destroyed. He's weeping for the inhabitants there because they haven't turned to him, and they'll be destroyed basically. And we hear in one other place as well of Jesus weeping when he's praying in Hebrews 5:7, perhaps referring to the Garden of Gethsemane. He knows what's coming, perhaps weeping. But this example in John 11 is so profound. 2 short words, Jesus weeping at the death of his friend. There's a lot I could say about this verse, despite it being 2 words.
Is it likely that when John, or when the author, wrote this verse, it was supposed to be full of meaning? It's supposed to be full of impact and significance? Or do you think maybe he was just writing a fact like Jesus picked up a cup?
Yeah, I think in the Gospel of John, there is, in a way, everything loaded with meaning right from the beginning. And the introduction of John makes clear you have to find a lot of meaning. The conclusion at the end makes clear there's a lot of meaning in this text. And the Gospel of John is written after the first 3 Gospels, which are called the Synoptic Gospels. That means the kind of traditional narratives of Jesus are already known either in written form to John or in a kind of oral tradition. But it's clear that the Gospel of John wants to say something in addition with a kind of deeper or more spiritual meaning.
One of the reasons that we know this phrase, Jesus wept, is because maybe it's more of a British thing, I don't know, but it gets used as a term of frustration or annoyance or something like this. So as a sort of, it's a roundabout way of blaspheming or something like that. So it is used as a very negative phrase, and it's known in that context. Yeah, the verse does get used in other popular contexts as well. I mean, there's quite a few songs which just refer to Jesus wept, or the title is Jesus wept, and this phrase has become part of our language. But one of the things I think is really funny is how this verse is so short in English, Jesus wept. And what I love is the fact that in Luther's famous German translation of the Bible, where English has Jesus wept, German has und Jesus, it's German, I don't know German. What does the German have? It's long anyway.
Actually, I was astonished that this belongs to the famous verses. I didn't thought that this is a verse which is very well known.
Und Jesus gingen die Augen über. So, yeah, anything but short.
So the only thing we normally speak about in the German Bible, in the German tradition, is the shortest chapter in the Bible, which is Psalm 117.
Based partly on the verse, Jesus wept, we have this idea of Jesus' tears actually being collected and sold as relics. So again, in the Middle Ages, these little containers were sold, which were said to contain the tears of Jesus. Now, I've never actually seen one of these. I haven't even seen a picture of one of these, but I can't even imagine do they still have the liquid in? I'm not sure. Maybe the liquid was said to have a divine property, so it kind of lasted for thousands of years. But they sold the tears of Jesus.